Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Jeremy Shapiro, Research Director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to get your perspective on this topic today because after U.S. forces launched an operation in Venezuela that ultimately led to the capture of the country's sitting leader, Nicolas Maduro, President Trump has repeatedly voiced his desire to acquire Greenland. He says that the United States needs this territory for national security purposes. So to start off the conversation, what do you make of the U.S.'s push to acquire Greenland?
Well, I think that the stated rationale is kind of self-evidently bullshit, if that's a phrase I can use on the podcast. The uh, the Danish government and the Greenlanders have offered the United States and President Trump any concession that he wants to help them to help him secure Greenland against Russian and Chinese depredations to increase Arctic security. They've taken any number of initiatives, and they have offered President Trump well, pretty much anything except sovereignty over Greenland, and he has refused those offers. So I think we can rule out the idea that this is about Arctic or U.S. national security. Simply isn't.
And President Trump has said that anything short of the Greenland being in the United States' hands, that's unacceptable. That's what he posted on Truth Social this morning. You recently penned a piece called How Greenland Falls. I want to talk about it because President Trump has mentioned Greenland and the United States acquiring it. He first floated this idea in his first term, the United States buying Greenland. People took that as a joke. President Trump has been known to say bombastic things. Now people are taking that really seriously. So how did we get here?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think when President Trump first brought this up in 2018, 2019, people didn't take it very seriously. And But since then, a couple of things have happened. First, the president has been pretty consistent about this since 2018, 2019. I wouldn't say he does it all the time, but he brings it up intermittently, and he seems quite serious about it. Secondly, he's demonstrated a greater tendency and capacity to actually operationalize his bombastic whims. We saw that most recently in Venezuela, where his ideas about regime change became true, or his idea about changing the president became true. And the reason for this seems to be that he has a much more loyal coterie of officials in his second administration. They're much more willing to turn Trump's bombasts into actual policy, and they're much more capable of it. And so I think it's become a necessity for people to treat sort of Trump's statements that seem bombastic in the first term as quite serious in the second term. And Greenland is, I think, high on that list because it's been such a consistent message of the president.
President Trump said that the Monroe Doctrine was justification for what went down in Venezuela in early January. And after Maduro's capture, President Trump said that we've now superseded the Monroe Doctrine. He now calls it the Don Roe Doctrine. So what did you learn from what the world saw in Venezuela, paired with this Don Roe Doctrine foreign policy that applies to how you view President Trump is now looking at the next steps to acquire Greenland?
I mean, it's not that hard to apply it, right? I mean, the doctrine that they've essentially propounded is that the Western Hemisphere belongs to America, and America can do whatever it wants in the Western Hemisphere, and that any opposition to U.S. Geopolitical desires in that hemisphere, whether they come from an indigenous government like the Venezuelan government, or whether they come from an outside force like the Danish government or the Russians or the Chinese, is illegitimate, and the U.S. is within its rights to do anything they want about it. That's not exactly the Monroe Doctrine. It is kind of the Roosevelt corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, which we've had now for 125 years. So it's not precisely new. Probably also not what is motivating the president in either Venezuela or Greenland, particularly in Greenland. It seems to be that this is because, as I said, in Greenland, could have had any of the security results he wanted. The Danish government was completely and is completely cooperative. I think what's going on here is a desire for personal aggrandizement as a sort of real estate mogul, someone who thinks in those terms. The idea of extending territory, being the president to make the United States yet larger, is something that he hopes will secure his place in history, put his face on Mount Rushmore, maybe rename it to Mount Trump. I don't know.
And to that point, President Trump told the New York Times that ownership of Greenland is psychologically needed for success. So he views that as something he needs psychologically. But your piece imagines this bloodless Trump takeover of Greenland. So what do you think that looks like? High level, if you could walk us through today to the end of President Trump's term, January 2029, what does that look like?
Sure. So I need to preface it by saying that I don't have any information that this is what the administration is planning or what they will do. What I wanted to do was to sketch out a way that this could work so that people can understand the possibilities and prepare for it. Having said that, I think what we're talking about is because Greenland is so politically and economically fragile. It is a very small, in terms of population, place that is very highly dependent on supply chains and very politically divided from its home country, Denmark. So what a campaign over the next couple of years to take over Greenland bloodlessly would look like is an effort to insert the United States into those, between those dependencies, to substitute the United States as the main supplier of Greenlandic needs, and to exploit and widen the divisions between Greenland and Denmark and Europe. And so what you could do is you could, in the first instance, interrupt supply chains between Denmark and Greenland, searching ships at sea. You could create mysterious internet and power outages on the island, and then you could make U.S. emergency assistance available to Greenlanders at the same time, so that they would become ever more dependent on U.S. infrastructure, U.S. supplies. Simultaneously, what you would be doing is you would be trying to corrupt just a few Greenlandic elites so that they would be interested in aligning with the United States, principally through economic incentives, personal economic incentives. And you wouldn't, I think we've seen polls on the island which show that that the United States is very unpopular, that something on the order of 85% of the Greenlandic population has no interest in joining the United States. So you wouldn't be looking to drive them toward any sort of vote, but you would be looking to find a few semi-corrupt officials and community leaders who could express some interest in joining the United States. Then you could reinforce those people with a U.S. security presence, so that when they got up and spoke, nobody could interrupt them. And they could, over the next couple of years, put forward ideas for closer association with the United States and independence from Greenland that could just be brought into effect without even a vote.
This is not a popular idea, right? This idea of the United States acquiring Greenland. It's not popular, as you said, in Greenland. The territory's prime minister said this: one thing must be clear to everyone. Greenland does not want to be owned by the United States. Greenland does not want to be governed by the United States. Greenland does not want to be part of the United States. I mean, that's pretty blunt. And then you have domestic polling. New poll from Reuters Ipsos found only 17% of Americans support Trump's push for Greenland. Only 4 Americans think it's a good idea for the United States to use the military to acquire the territory. What do you make of this unpopularity, both domestically and internationally? Do you think that will play a role here?
No, I don't think it'll play a big role. I should say, in the interest of full disclosure, that I'm definitely part of the American public that doesn't think this is a good idea for any number of reasons. But I don't believe that this is something that is very important to the American public. Generally speaking, the president has a lot of latitude in international affairs. The Venezuela operation was also not popular with the American public, particularly before the president started creating political impetus behind it. And he can do more or less whatever he wants, despite public opinion, as long as he doesn't have any massive failures. And it's hard to see any big failures coming out of Greenland. So I'm not convinced that the American public opposition is that significant. I think the Greenlandic opposition is somewhat more significant because it is hard to take over a territory when everybody hates you, and clearly Greenlanders are not interested in the United States. I understand that they're particularly afraid of our healthcare system, which I have to say from recent experience is a reasonable fear. So I think that needs to be finessed. But in the scenario in the Foreign Affairs article that I described, the way that you finesse that is, first of all, by making them dependent on the United States. Secondly, by corrupting local elites. And thirdly, by evading asking them what they think. And I think all of that is possible. Unfortunately, in the modern world, as we're seeing today in Iran, as we've seen the last few years in Venezuela, just because the public wants a specific regime doesn't mean they get it. And Greenland is poor, it is sparsely populated, it is weak, and it wouldn't be that difficult for the United States to take it over, even if its population was opposed to it. I think that's something that we can all regret, but it isn't something that we should pretend isn't true.
I don't blame the people of Greenland for being afraid of the American healthcare system. I think if you asked any American on the street who's ever had to deal with our healthcare system, they would probably say the same thing. But in your piece, you said that
Denmark takes us over and imposes their healthcare system on us.
Hey, you never know. I mean, in this world, you never know. And in your piece, you do say this, that this move could redefine the nature of international order and sovereignty. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think if something like this were to happen, I think what you would see people understanding is that in the modern world, sovereignty comes less from the sort of public will than from the dependencies that you have on other countries. That you're only as independent as your dependency on other countries through various channels, through supply chains, through finance, through energy resources, through mineral resources. All of these things create dependencies between countries, and sovereignty, which is a sort of fancy word for independence, can only be realized if you have not exactly total independence, but a symmetric interdependence with other countries. And if you become too asymmetrically dependent, as Greenland is, then you're opening yourself up to a very modern form of imperialism, where a country like the United States, which can profit from those asymmetric dependencies, can effectively erode and even destroy your sovereignty through use of your dependence.
There was a meeting right before you and I jumped on this call, and it was between officials from Denmark and Greenland. They met with some members of the Trump administration. And the Danish foreign minister, he described the conversations that he had with members of the Trump administration, including Vice President J.D. Vance, as frank but constructive. He said, though, that they still have a fundamental disagreement with the United States over Greenland. Read between the lines there. I mean, it's pretty blunt. It's pretty frank there, as he said. What do you think? Do you think that matters? Do you think that's deterring the United States at all?
I think that it matters, yes. If it does seem, I assume that the fundamental disagreement remains that the United States insists on a transfer of sovereignty through some mechanism or another, and Greenland and Denmark are implacably opposed to that. And that does require the United States to take, if Greenland were to agree, we could just pass them some cash and change the maps. But so that matters for sure. But I think what it means is that the U.S. has to move to other options. Those options are possible, but potentially costly. As I said, I think they're a very bad idea. The one that is most talked about is direct military action. That's certainly feasible, but I think very costly in terms of the U.S. standing in the world and in terms of the future of the NATO alliance, and so quite risky and a sort of strange move to take for an island which is not that important in the grand scheme of things after all. And the other option is the one that I describe of a sort of geo-osmosis where you absorb the country. I think that also has risks and costs, and probably most troublingly for Donald Trump, it takes a couple of years. So he would have to have patience there.
I know that President Trump, as we talked about at the top of this conversation, he brought this up. It was initially, seemingly, people thought it was a joke. Now he's not letting it go. Obviously, there were meetings just today about it. Do you think, I know that your piece was called How Greenland Falls, but do you think Greenland definitely falls? Do you think by the end of President Trump's term here, the United States will have acquired Greenland? What do you think the odds are there?
Yeah, certainly not. Nothing is inevitable, and I think there is a pretty good chance that the president gets distracted or just stops caring about this. We've seen that on many issues before, so it's certainly not guaranteed. I guess all I can say is that he hasn't lost interest in this yet, and he has the tools that he needs to make it so. Whether those things have costs, and whether he will be willing to pay those costs, I'm not sure. And really, I think maybe even more importantly, whether he will maintain his focus and attention on this issue, I'm also not sure. It doesn't seem to have a lot of support, as we noted, within the American public. It doesn't have a lot of support even in the Congress or even within his own administration. So it has to be him that pushes it forward. And he loses focus. He loses focus on things, and maybe he will lose focus on this, but I'm certainly not sure.
And as of now, it doesn't seem like he's losing focus on it. But as we see what's next when it comes to Greenland, I hope you can come back on and break it down with me. Jeremy Shapiro, thank you so much for the time. You are welcome back anytime.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.